Good morning, everybody here in the United States, or good afternoon if you're in the UK or elsewhere in Europe. This is Duncan Edwards, CEO of British American Business, and it's a real pleasure for me to welcome you all to this special webinar, during which we're going to be talking about the US political scene, and particularly the general election and other elections that are coming up later this year, and the impact of this extraordinary crisis on the political scene here in the US. What we're trying to do at BAB is to mix our programming between the kind of practical help that our members want about how to navigate this crisis, with occasionally a kind of big picture event, big picture view about the other things that matter to our members, the political environment being one of them, of course, and the kind of economic and business environment, which we covered in our event with McKinsey earlier this week. So it's great to have you all with us, and it's particularly a privilege for us to have two such eminent commentators with us today to give their views about what's going on here in the United States. First of all, Dr. Jeremy Rosner. Jeremy is the managing partner at GQR and founder at GQR, one of the world's leading consultancies and pollsters, political opinion takers, who works with parties, candidates, governments, NGOs, and businesses. And as we'll hear, he is a leading opinion pollster, still active in this very unusual time. We were chatting before we came on air about the challenges for pollsters at this kind of interesting time. And Jeremy works with a lot of companies, many members of British American Business, like Boeing, BP, McKinsey, Microsoft, and others. So it's great to have you with us. Of course, Jeremy has also served as a special advisor in the Clinton administration. And we're also extremely happy to have with us from early morning down in California, Dr. Lan Hee Chen, who is a senior counselor at the Brunswick Group. And he also advises on policy issues, regulatory issues, using his extensive political background and experience. Lan Hee is a fellow at the Hoover Institution. He's a director of domestic policy studies at Stanford. And he's been super active in a number of political campaigns over the years, 4 presidential efforts, and was policy director of the Romney Ryan campaign. So we're going to have two kind of interesting perspectives on what's going on here in the US. So gentlemen, it's great to have you with us today. Thank you for joining us, and let's jump straight in. And Jeremy, I'm going to kind of start with you, if I may. We last saw each other in London a couple of months ago. It feels like a lifetime ago, and at that point, I don't know, there were still a dozen Democrats in the race. A lot's changed since then. So the Democrats now have a candidate they've identified. Kind of what's your sense of where the Democrats are in that process? Has the crisis shortened the process of finding a candidate? And what happens with the rest of the primaries that are still due to run? Maybe you could just give us a sense of where things stand.
Sure. Well, Duncan, first of all, thank you for the introduction, and thanks to British American Business for hosting this. It's a pleasure to be with you and with Lan Hee. It was, I think, exactly 9 weeks ago that we were together in London for a British American Business event. And at the time, I was saying that things were notably unpredictable. Well, that was only because of Bernie Sanders. That was before COVID burst into our awareness. And now things have gone from notably unpredictable to completely unprecedented. So we are in terra incognita. And I think all predictions I would make at this point, I would caveat heavily, because all the models and experiences we've had in the past are of limited use at this point. But at this point, as you say, the Democrats have settled on their candidate, and really did before COVID burst onto the scene, at least into the American awareness. I don't think there's any question Joe Biden will be the nominee. The only question will be who his running mate is, and he's already said it'll be a woman. There's a question about whether the Democratic convention, which has now been pushed back into mid-August, will be live or virtual. The party insists it will be a live, real convention, which is what the Republicans are saying, but that's, I think, will be seen. There have been 15 states that have delayed their primaries at this point, so we do have a lot more states left to go. But at this point, Joe Biden has about 2/3 of the 1,991 delegates, pledged delegates he needs to secure the nomination. And that's just, that's really no longer in question. So the party, I think, when we last met, it was quite open as to whether Democrats were going to be able to pull together early. I think they pulled together much, much more quickly than any of us thought they would. And now the conversation is squarely about the general election.
Well, it was quite a, as the primaries went on, it was quite an ideological fight, and there was certainly some strong voices from the progressive wing of the party, which had a big influence on, or seemed to have a big influence on policy kind of positions that candidates were taking. So is your sense that the party is happy with the decision it's made? And there has been some kind of gossip about, maybe something will change at the convention and someone will come riding in as a white knight as an outside candidate. Is that just kind of journalistic nonsense that people with too little to do looking for gossip?
Yes, that's exactly what it is. It's people with too little to do looking for gossip. There is no chance that an Andrew Cuomo or anybody else is going to come riding in and be swapped. I think the party is pretty happy with the choice. I think it's no secret that President Trump and Republicans were eager for Bernie Sanders to get the nomination because they saw him as the easiest opponent to defeat. They've been aware for a long time that Joe Biden is a formidable candidate. That's why they were trying to dig up dirt on him in Ukraine, and why they've been so focused on negative campaigning against him. Right now, the polls show Joe Biden on average about 6 points ahead compared to Hillary being 2 points ahead in the popular vote in 2016. So it's, and it's quite a substantial lead at this point, and Biden is a formidable opponent for Trump. For sure, there are people on the left, Bernie Bros, as they're called, who are not happy with the choice. And I think some of them, may vote for third-party candidates. They did in 2016. But generally, the party has come pretty much together from the very beginning of this race. And we were involved with one of the early presidential candidates. And in our very first polling, it was clear that there was only one thing on the minds of Democrats, and that's beating Donald Trump. And so the vast majority of Democrats are highly motivated to fall in line behind their nominee and to support Biden. But I do think, the center of gravity in the Democratic Party has shifted to the left, and the progressive policies that Bernie and Elizabeth Warren and others were promoting have had an impact on the party, and certainly on the impact of the policies that Biden is now representing. Now, I think COVID has pushed politics to the left as well in some ways.
Right.
Talk of austerity in the US or anywhere else is pretty much dead. On the other hand, it's pushed it to the right in some ways on things like immigration. So yeah, the center of gravity has moved, but the nominee for the Democrats is very centrist.
Well, we'll come back to some of those points because you're absolutely right. This is unprecedented change in the role of government in the economy in the United States. And whatever happens, it feels like some of that will stay after the end of this crisis. So Lan He, perhaps you can give us some inside perspective from the GOP position. I guess prior to this crisis, the president and other GOP candidates in the other elections going on will have been running on the economy. This was just the everything that the president talked about, and it was real. That the stock market, wages, everything was going in the right direction, employment numbers, and so on and so forth. So, how does this play for the incumbent now, given that a lot of what the original strategy would have been has gone? I guess replaced by an opportunity to talk to the country every evening. But kind of what's the mood in the GOP?
Well, I do think that the last several weeks and months have changed the dynamic pretty fundamentally. I've always thought this would be an election that was a referendum on Donald Trump, one way or the other. And the question of how voters view the president, I think, has changed in the sense that it was, I think, gearing up to be, as you noted, Duncan, an economics-focused election. Not to say that economics won't be a major factor. I think it will be, but I think overwhelmingly now the issue for Donald Trump and for any other Republican running for re-election is the perceived handling of the coronavirus crisis. And that is going to be an issue that will be multifaceted. It will take twists and turns between now and November. But I think for Republicans, the challenge becomes how do you formulate a narrative in light of the fact that the economic story is going to be challenging at best. We all know that some of the economic downturn that we've seen thus far is probably just the tip of the iceberg. We're going to likely see continued disruption in labor markets. The unemployment rate will increase. The stock market is notoriously unpredictable. And so as we move toward the summer and fall, I think the question will be, where does the narrative come from? The other factor that's going to be a challenge is the uneven response so far. And I think you're seeing an uneven response to the coronavirus on the public health side. And I think you're seeing the core of a challenge for Republicans, which is you've got governors and the administration at loggerheads sometimes. Sometimes those administrations in states are actually run by Republican governors, and they're running into issues potentially with the White House as well. And so how do you reconcile the need to put together a unified message with some of the disparate messages that are emerging in certain states? There was a recent controversy, or not really controversy, but a recent issue in the state of Maryland, which of course is governed by a guy named Larry Hogan, a Republican who's done a terrific job as governor. He and the president got into a little disagreement over access to testing.
Yeah.
And that kind of conflict within the Republican Party is not helpful in terms of trying to create a more unified narrative, particularly for the president going into the election. So I tend to think that for the Republicans, there's going to be a little bit of casting about until the right message is found, given how much of the focus is going to be on coronavirus. And let me just say one last thing, Duncan, which is I think you're seeing the president pursuing a couple of different campaign strategies already over the course of the last week. You saw him very intensely focused on China for several days. That focus is likely to continue. You've seen him now come to the issue of immigration, which is a strong rallying cry for the Republican base and does tend to unify and animate many elements of the Republican base. You've seen Mitch McConnell and other Republicans in the Congress go after Nancy Pelosi for the delays on reauthorization or re-upping of the so-called Paycheck Protection Program, which has been designed to help small businesses. So you're going to see a bunch of different nets in the water, if you will, until they can kind of agree on what the best strategy is and what the most effective way is of motivating voters going forward.
Yeah, and it's very interesting, isn't it? your point about that judgment will be made about how the administration handled the challenge, and seems to me that there are two parts to that, at least, and probably more. But the first is kind of the big principle issues. The big principles: should government get involved? How much should government get involved? And all of that, which broadly, Western governments around the world have followed broadly the same pattern in terms of massive government engagement in the public purse, backing business and providing support. But then the other side of it is execution, isn't it? It's about, how did you manage things day to day? What happened, and so on. So do you think that do you think there would have been a massive difference between the way a democratic administration might have handled the big picture issue, or is this just just there for the sake of argument, that points are being scored because they can be scored on execution?
Well, it's a good distinction, Duncan, between the macro sense of what government would have done to respond and then the executional points. I do think on the macro, it's hard to imagine the economic response from the federal government being any more robust, in terms of magnitude. Perhaps you would have seen a few more things around the edges, maybe a few more hundreds of billions of dollars here or there, which, I know it sounds crazy. It's a lot of money, but fundamentally, the kind of response that you've seen in each successive round of recovery legislation, I think is roughly consistent, whether it was going to be a Republican president or Democratic president. I think for Republicans, the mindset has been to shift basically to accepting that a large and significant federal government spending program was going to be necessary for this. And this was something, of course, during the economic crises of 2008, 2009 was much more controversial for Republicans. The Republican Party's also changed since then, though. The attention paid to fiscal conservatism and issues of fiscal responsibility, I think, is much less robust now than it was back in that 2008, 2009 period. So on the macro level, I don't see much difference. Clearly, the execution is where this is going to be fought out. And we've seen skirmish after skirmish on a variety of public health issues, whether it's testing, ventilators, PPE access, you name it. There has been a conflict between Democrats and Republicans. This has been a big issue. So, I absolutely would expect that on the public health front, on the related economic front, you're going to hear issues brought up by either side with respect to execution. And the voters are ultimately going to have to decide who's right. Was it the case that the Trump administration was ill prepared and has been poor in execution? Or is it the case, as President Trump argues, that they've actually been quite robust in responding to a crisis that was unseen, unknown, and unpreparable for? I think those will be important questions.
Yeah, no, I think you're right. And Jeremy, what's your sense about this? About well, first of all, what are the voters saying? But then also, what's the right response if you were advising Democratic candidates? Is there much disagreement about the big picture thing, about the role of government in response? And if so, what is that? Or is it really, as we've discussed, about execution and management and handling of the execution of the policy?
Yeah, I think Lonnie's broadly right. At the macro level, especially on the economic front, I think everyone's roughly in the same place. I think actually the response would not have been as big with a Democrat in the White House, only because the Republicans in Congress would have, and particularly in the Senate, would have restrained a Democratic president as they did with Obama in 2008 and 2009. I think there's a lot of chatter on the Hill that Republicans in Congress were actually not very happy with going to $2 trillion and now $3 trillion on the stimulus response, and only did so because Trump, who is not very ideological at all, was pushing this. And I think with a Democrat, they would have not have gone nearly as far. So, ironically, we probably have a bigger stimulus at the macro level than if we'd had a Democratic president. But Lonnie's right. This is very much about execution. There is a little bit of an ideological difference about execution, and we're seeing that now between Democrats and Republicans on whether the priority is on the economy or health. Voters are roughly 60-40 at this point on saying that it's more important to deal with the health aspects, even if that slows down the economic recovery, rather than focusing, liberalizing and reopening on the economic front, even if that makes the health consequences a little worse. 60-40 in favor of keeping the focus on health, and it's stronger depending on how you ask the question. So that Trump's focus on reopening and some of the focus on some of the governors in Georgia and places like that are quite out of step. And the only people who agree with that priority of focusing more on the economy, we just completed a survey on April 19th, nationwide survey, 2,000 responses, and we probed this quite a lot. And it's really quite striking. Democrats by about 80% say the focus should be on health. Independents, who are now looking more like Democrats than like independents, by a very big majority, 60%, say the focus should be on health and not economy. The only people where there's a majority who support focusing on the economy more are Republicans. The Republican base, which is what Trump is playing to now, are notably out of step with the rest of America at this point. And the more he plays toward his base, the more he alienates independents and drives them away. So I think there's this question, it's not just, did you manage well in execution? It's driven by an ideological difference about where the priority should be and what sort of an economic consequence we should be willing to bear in order to protect all members of society against a resurgence either now or in a second wave in next winter. I think it's interesting as well to see that on the question of execution, not only is Trump badly losing independents at this point, which is the big story, but there's also some signs that the red wall, the hard base of support that Trump has had, may be starting to crack. In our survey, we asked on an open-ended basis for everybody, what's Trump doing well in this, what's Trump doing poorly on COVID. And it was very striking that even among self-identified Republicans, 17% of them in an open-ended response were critical of him, and not critical of him, not that he's buying into this hoax of COVID or he's opening the economy too soon, but critical of him in the same way Democrats would be, that he's lying about the facts, that he was hesitant to acknowledge as a process, that he's bad on testing, all these sort of arguments you would typically get from Democrats. 17% of all Republicans, and even if only a third of them say were to be pushed off of voting for him as a result, that would still be 2% of the vote. So, and that's sort of all you need in this election. So I think it is about execution. It'll be one of the huge questions, and we're starting to see some real cracks.
Well, it's interesting, actually. By the way, I should remind everybody, please send in your questions. There's a Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. Just use that rather than the chat function, and send in your questions, and I will try to cover those as we go through the discussion. Obviously, I'm following what's happening in the UK as well, and it seems quite similar that there's the issue about what would the response have been from a different government. Probably the same in principle, but then all the arguments and all the journalistic kind of scandal and other things are all about execution. And I'm wondering on this kind of question about health versus the economy. It is quite a nuanced question, of course, and you can ask it in a very simple way, and but it's a more nuanced question. It feels to me than that, because the economic downturn will have health consequences clearly. But is there any risk that people in replying to polls will provide the answer that they're expected to provide, rather than, which seemed to be the case, in the 2016 election as well, so that there is some kind of polling kind of issue there about a question as emotional as would you rather spend money on health or the economy? I'll ask you, Jeremy, and then we'll get a view from Lan He as well.
There's always a risk of people leaning toward the socially preferred answer, but this has been asked a lot of ways, in a lot of clever ways that don't have obvious socially acceptable or socially responsible bias. And by the way, it's true all over the world. We've been looking at every poll worldwide that's coming out on COVID, and this seems to be a global constant at this point at about 60, 70% looking toward health. Now, I think that'll come down as we move from people's focus on the health consequences and as they go through more months of recession. And it's already come down a little bit, but I don't think it's due to socially preferred response. And I think people have quite an informed view at this point, and they're consuming news like crazy. News consumption all over the world has just skyrocketed. That the way to defeat this is through lockdown, social distancing. There's a threat of resurgence if you go back out. There's a threat of resurgence when we get back into winter and a second wave, and they're very determined to sort of beat this and flatten the curve rather than have this spike up again.
So Lan He, I don't know whether you have a view about that particular question about the poll, that whether that really reflects people's genuine feelings about the economy versus health.
Yeah. Well, look, I think that the challenge with, and it necessarily has to be framed as a dichotomy or has to be framed as two concepts in conflict, but they can't be, and any reasonable society will at some point decide which of those two priorities you begin to preference over the other. It's unrealistic for the United States to remain locked down in the way it's been for the last 4 weeks. It's unrealistic for any society to do so for an extended period of time. So the question becomes, how do you emerge from it? What's the responsible way to restart economic activity? And, so I think in that sense, the media in the United States perpetuates a little bit of this false dichotomy, in my view, that it's got to be one or the other. Right. So you'll hear somebody on who's a public health expert saying things are dire, things are still dire, we still need to be concerned. Bob Redfield, the director of the US CDC, was on TV yesterday talking about how the second wave this winter will potentially be worse in the United States than the first wave. I have every reason to believe that as a matter of public health, that's probably right. But what does that mean then? Does that mean that the US economy remains shut down between now and November? Absolutely not. That's unacceptable for any number of different reasons. And so the issue will now become, how do voters view the reopening process? Do they view it in a way that suggests that authorities have handled it responsibly and have handled it well and have handled it thoughtfully? Or do they view it as sort of being a rush into something that we're not ready for? And I think that question is going to be very illustrative of how voters view the performance of various public officials as we go into the election this year. But the idea that it's one or the other is a completely false dynamic. And I would urge people to be more responsible as they present options. Certainly public leaders, media leaders, business leaders need to recognize that we're talking about a gradation, not an on and off switch here. So, that doesn't necessarily mean I think we should all be going out to get haircuts on Sunday. But I do think that we have to be careful about this idea that it's one or the other, either complete shutdown or complete reopening.
It's very interesting. I mean, it's not only politicians that are going to be subject to a review of their behavior during this crisis. Clearly, businesses, our members are very aware of reputational risk as to behavior. and journalists too. And I think there's going to be some interesting studies done about the behavior of journalists during this period of time. Just staying with you, Lan, the president is extremely visible every day. He's taken the decision to front this press conference relatively, and we'll bring Jeremy back in a minute on this. Joe Biden is less visible perhaps than you would otherwise be at this stage of a presidential campaign. Which is the smarter strategy?
Well, Donald Trump certainly thinks his strategy is a smarter strategy. He believes that anytime he's not out there kind of being the messenger of his own message, that's a bad day. If he's not out there representing his own point of view, that's a bad situation. Now, there are disagreements about whether he's in fact become a little overexposed. Is he, is a 2-hour press briefing really the best strategy? I don't pretend to have the right answer to that. I think different pundits are going to have different sets of beliefs about what's right and wrong. I do know the president believes that he needs to be out there controlling his own message, and that the more he's out there articulating it on his own, the better off he is. As far as Biden, conventional wisdom on a presidential campaign, having been involved in a number of them, the conventional wisdom would be, hey, we got to get our candidate out there. We've got to be part of the news cycle. I don't know that Joe Biden needs to be part of this conversation right now. I don't know that he is all the worse for staying out of these skirmishes that we're seeing. And, at some point he's going to have to emerge. At some point he's going to have to have an earned media push. At some point he's going to have a paid media push. But what's pretty clear to me, at least, is that there's not a lot of benefit coming out of this back and forth on any number of different issues right now. So in some ways, this gives Joe Biden the opportunity to sit back, figure out what kind of campaign strategy he wants to plot going forward, given how dynamic and how quickly things are changing in the U.S. landscape. It's not bad that he's not out there every single news cycle. I think it's a good opportunity to develop some thinking about what kind of issues he wants to push as he goes toward the fall campaign, thinking about the development of campaign infrastructure, which challengers always have to develop this. When I worked with Mitt Romney in 2012, we were at a significant disadvantage in terms of working against the president's architecture and the president's campaign. And I'd argue that in April and May, this time period, that was when voter views of Mitt Romney were cemented. Yeah. And, Trump doesn't have that opportunity right now because he's focused on responding to coronavirus. They're trying, the RNC and other entities are trying to define Joe Biden, but I don't think they're doing it successfully because there's so much news going on about coronavirus. No one's paying attention to the election right now. So in some ways, you can argue this has been a blessing in disguise for Joe Biden. This has been an opportunity for him to take the time and take the breather that presidential challengers usually don't have at this phase of the campaign. And so I don't see it as a disadvantage necessarily. I think we'll see how the president's daily media appearances are going to serve him in the long run. I do know one last thing is that the president desperately wants to get back out on the trail. He wants to get out there because he gets energy from the 50,000, 40,000, 30,000 person rallies he's holding. It's not the same.
Yeah.
Skirmishing with the press in the Brady briefing room in the White House is very different from being in an environment where you're surrounded by 30,000 adoring fans. And I think he wants to get out there, and he wants to get out there quickly because he recognizes that the dynamic is simply different, and his ability to communicate a message is somewhat premised on his ability to have the backdrop in the audience he wants.
Jeremy, do you agree with that? I mean, would you think Biden is well advised to stay less visible at the moment and work on his kind of policy issues, maybe thinking about his VP pick and so on? But we've had a couple of questions on this. I mean, how do you cut through? I mean, assuming you want to cut through at the moment and get policy messages out to your voters or your potential voters, what's the right strategy for the candidate?
Yeah. One Republican strategist recently said that what Joe Biden says and does right now will matter very little for the outcome of the election. but what Donald Trump says and does right now will make all the difference in the world.
Yeah.
Because as you know, as Lonnie says, in every presidential election where there's an incumbent, mostly it's a referendum on the incumbent. I think that remains true. There's not a lot Joe Biden can do. You know, he's actually trying to get heard and putting out all kinds of communications, but there's not much he can do, and frankly, it doesn't matter right now. This is all about Donald Trump's handling of the pandemic and of the economic recovery. And so I don't think it's a problem for Biden particularly right now. He's got a lot of work to do. He's behind on fundraising. He's behind on digital. He's got a lot of decisions to make about structure, about vice president. He's got to integrate with the DNC and basically take over the party machinery. So he's got all that to deal with, and I think it's fine for him to focus on that right now.
So just going back to one of the things we touched on right at the start, and this is the kind of the scale of the response from government in the United States, and it's the same in the UK. You know, in a sense, you can characterize this as a massive step towards kind of more economic socialism, whatever you want to call it, whatever your term of preference is, but a gigantically big step for the economic involvement of the public purse in the economy. I mean, is the sense that this is and there's an argument. There's a lot of the arguments that the progressive wing of the Democrats were making is kind of being brought to the table here, and not probably exactly how they would have preferred it, but how they would have chosen. But nevertheless, the huge increase in the involvement of the state in the economy. Is that likely to become a permanent feature? And it's been enacted by Republicans, of course. So is that likely, is this a step change in the way kind of government in America sees itself, its engagement in kind of the social world, more along European lines? Maybe Jeremy, you'll have a first crack at that, and then we'll ask Lanhee afterwards.
Yeah, it's a total change, but I think it's probably temporary, as it was during World War II or other big emergencies. I think right now the old line of right versus left has disappeared. It's been replaced by life versus death, and there really is the right-left axis is just not on most issues. It is not operating right now. The election is going to come down to four questions. One is, how well or how poorly Donald Trump and his administration managed the pandemic. The second is a question of who's best to fix the economy. When we go into November, the economy is going to be in terrible shape. And this is a really complicated and interesting question. In the focus, we just did a nationwide focus group on April 14th. And it was just stunning because people were quite critical of the COVID response. But then when you say who's going to be best to fix the economy, and these were all swing voters, it was overwhelming that Donald Trump is the best prepared to fix the economy. And you said, why? And they said, because he's a businessman. And they didn't have any sense of what Joe Biden would do. And so, even since then, Trump's rating on the economy has come down. But, his rating on handling the pandemic is below his overall job approval rating for the first time now. But his rating on the economy is still a few points above his overall job approval rating. So he has that strength. And so that's the second big question is will his rating on the economy come down as we go through another 6 months of recession? And will Joe Biden and the Democrats put out a positive economic vision that's persuasive? Third question is about turnout. We just don't know who's going to turn out. And that was really the deciding factor in many ways in 2016, who turned out to vote. The Wisconsin election we had just the other day suggests this might not be a disaster for the Democratic side, but actually just nobody knows. It depends a lot on what laws people put in place state by state, since elections regulated at the state level here, for mail-in voting, health protections, social distancing, all sorts of things to allow people to vote. South Korea just had an election last week. They had incredible protections and mail-in voting, and they had the highest turnout in 28 years. So it's possible to have elections that function well, but no one knows how many people are going to vote and who's going to vote. And then the fourth question is, what does COVID persuade people that we need to change as a society? Does it lead people to decide that we need to clamp down, have more state control, less immigration, biomonitoring of everyone's health, or that we, or that we need to invest in healthcare, trust science more, deal with some of the divisions of income and wealth in the US and maybe elsewhere that have become so pronounced. So I think those are the big four questions, and they're not largely left-right questions anymore. The axis has shifted, although I think that'll come roaring back, when we get to the point where COVID is no longer the dominant issue.
It tends to be, Lan He, that it's Republican governments that end up having larger deficits financially than Democrat governments over the decades. So what's your sense? Is this a temporary change to the American model of government involvement in the economy?
I think it is temporary to the degree that, in times of crisis, you always find a willingness to enact policies that you wouldn't find in sort of ordinary times. I would say that Donald Trump, in some ways, evades these traditional lines as well. The degree to which he was already promoting larger deficits, kind of a comfort level with, for example, government expenditures, whether directly in the form of spending or indirectly in the form of tax expenditures. I think you are already seeing that Donald Trump scrambled the traditional sense of what a Republican president would do and the kinds of things that a Republican president would advocate for. I think it would be wrong to presume that because we've seen significant government action, a large spike in government spending, that means we're now going to be cementing a view that the federal government ought to be more involved in people's lives in all areas, whether it's a move toward a Medicare for all style solution, as Bernie Sanders has wanted in the healthcare space, a move toward free college tuition for everybody, as Elizabeth Warren wanted during her campaign. I think it would be an error to ascribe Americans' willingness to forgive or to not think about issues of fiscal responsibility in the context of the response to COVID-19 as somehow more broadly emblematic of their desire to institute broader federal government control. There are still things that are very American, a deep concern about privacy and about the government's role in tracking individual protected health information is one example of that. I think Americans, broadly speaking, are relatively cool still to the idea that, technology companies might have access on behalf of the government to individual health information that, even though could be used to help stop the spread of pandemic illness, would implicate significant concerns that run counter to our values as Americans. And so I think it is, I've heard the argument made by some on the left in particular that this defines a new normal for what an appropriate amount of government spending is. But I disagree with that. I think most Americans don't see this as a rule, but rather the exception to the rule.
You certainly hear it about healthcare. And you contrast the kind of, I'm not sure whether government in Europe enjoys the fact that they are the responsible manager of the healthcare system, but that's what they are. And but you certainly do hear it there, and you may end up, this may be the trigger for for actually passing an infrastructure bill that gets done. Certainly you hear those kind of positive noises about a massive infrastructure investment potentially coming as a result of this crisis. Let me get back into some of the sort of more practical details, the nitty gritty of the election. And of course, the president did not win the popular vote last time, but he won through the electoral college system. Is there anything we can see today about those important Midwestern states, and particularly how what's happening locally in those states might impact the view of the federal government. Is the strategy, Lan He, again for the president to focus on the electoral college rather than the popular votes?
Yeah, no, I think that is the focus. Let's just take one example of an issue where the president has tried to consolidate and coalesce his base and drive intensity with his base, and that is the conflict over Michigan and what Governor Whitmer has done in Michigan, for example, to shut down the economy in a very significant and comprehensive way. The president, I believe it was last week or late last week, tweeted "Liberate Michigan." And that, of course, drew a lot of controversial response and scorn, particularly in the media. But that may have been, in fact, a very specific strategy, which is to speak to his voters, his base of support in Michigan, to get them animated, to know that he's standing with them. And it speaks to a strategy that runs through that part of the country again, although I think there are reasons to believe that that will be a challenge given the economic situation in those states, particularly hard hit those states have been. And so, you see the president trying to speak to a base of support. You see the president trying to appeal to that base of support, doing it in a way that a lot of people may scratch their heads. But in fact, I think there is a concerted effort here to really drive turnout, to Jeremy's point, drive turnout, drive intensity, drive interest with those voters who would support him, in the hope that he can win that turnout race in a way that gives him an advantage in those states. I don't think there's any strategy where the president can pursue a win in the popular vote. This is really about making sure that he is cementing his position in states where he did well in 2016 and needs to do well again to win the election in 2020.
And Jeremy, I'd be keen to get your comments on that. And I think we've also had a couple of questions about the VP pick, and he's declared that that Biden's declared that he'll pick a woman. And so does that mean he's going to pick a woman from the Midwest to help him in those states, or what's your sense in that regard?
Yeah, on the electoral college, for sure. Both parties will focus on the electoral college because, for better or worse, it's the system we have. And the result in the electoral college will be closer than the popular vote as it was last time. As you noted, Trump lost the popular vote by 2 points last time. He still won the electoral college. You can lose the popular vote by maybe 2 points, maybe 3, maybe 4, and still win the electoral college. After that, it's almost impossible. Right now, Biden's ahead by 6. In our latest poll that ended on April 19th, he was ahead by 9 points. Once you allocated the people who said they were undecided on who to vote for. So I think the map, looks harder for Trump at this point. Pennsylvania has moved since 2016. Michigan is still close, but it's moved toward the Democrats since 2016. Wisconsin is going to be, for this time, what Florida was in 2000, the pivotal state. But there are other states that weren't in play before, like Arizona, which is starting to look pretty purple, and where you've got a very strong Democratic Senate candidate there who's likely to win, I think. So I think the map looks pretty hard for Trump, and I think the issue terrain looks pretty hard. And there have been press reports about a very divisive fight in the Trump camp and in the White House right now about whether to attack Biden and try to disqualify him and sort of swift vote him, as they did with John Kerry in 2004, and these attacks that he's too close to China, or whether to talk about his positive role, as Kellyanne Conway and others around the president are advocating all the good things he's done on COVID. The problem is neither of those arguments is working terribly well right now. His numbers are headed south on job approval, on vote, on generic congressional ballot. Not at a fast rate, but at a steady rate. And so it's tough for him. On the vice presidential pick, who knows? The betting in the political betting sites has Kamala Harris ahead. I think that's who I would suspect has the advantage right now for a number of reasons. She's not Midwest and she's not from a state that is a swing state, but she has lots of other strengths. But sure, there's people like Governor Whitmer of Michigan, loom very large. People like Tammy Baldwin from Wisconsin, who can maybe provide a nudge of just a few thousand votes in those critical states. There's about 9 or 10 women who are plausible, but it's really, it's anybody's guess which of them gets the nod at this point. I don't think Joe Biden knows at this point. They're still going through all the vetting that's necessary.
So one of the things that's going to be important to our members, of course, is trade and the kind of global economy that has enabled companies to build their businesses around the world over the increasingly liberalized global economy that has enabled people to build their businesses around the world. And certainly we're seeing kind of some concerning signs, and comments coming out as a result of this crisis about, bringing jobs home, local production lines, some lots of anti-China rhetoric, which I suspect is going to be bipartisan, but some general sort of negative voices around trade and globalization. I just, it matters hugely to us, but do voters care about this stuff? And is it going to be an issue that is going to be talked about, Lan He, in the campaign?
Well, trade is a really significant policy issue, and there's no question it has a tremendous impact on the economy. I think for voters, they, from my experience, they've tended to view trade much more skeptically over the last 10 years than they did before. I think the level of intervention that we are potentially going to see from the federal government in, for example, mandating supply chains away from China, particularly when it comes to crucial equipment, whether technology equipment, protective equipment, pharmacological substances, the level of intrusion that I think we're going to see, is I think there is a bipartisan agreement in the United States amongst policymakers that more has to be done to police the supply chain, as it were. Somebody who believes in the free flow of goods and information across national lines, that's distressing to me. But I understand the perspective of many Americans, which is we don't want to find ourselves behind the 8 ball again. And anything we can do to prevent that from happening, policymakers should do. So I do think the dynamic has shifted even more on trade, to the degree that free trade and the degree that trade agreements, for example, were disfavored because of the perception that they had a negative impact on labor. I think those perceptions have only increased during the course of the current crisis. That having been said, I think whether it's Donald Trump or Joe Biden in the next 4 years, I think both men are going to pursue in their own ways a relatively robust trade agenda. On Trump's side, he was clearly making progress, or wanted to make progress, on bilateral agreements, one with the UK, which was well publicized, a separate EU agreement, maybe agreements with some countries in Asia. And I think with Biden, you're going to see a multilateral approach. You're going to see something like TPP, although no one wants to call it that. You're going to see a migration back toward multilateral trade deals. But in either case, I think both Donald Trump and Joe Biden understand the value of trade. Now, Trump may rhetorically be a little bit heavier-handed with it. But at the end of the day, in terms of the policy, I think both gentlemen are likely to pursue some route that runs down the free trade avenue with some diversions for, as I said, supply chain issues in critical industries. But it's a hard sell for the American voter, for the American public. I think there is a skepticism broadly about trade.
Yeah, I mean, we were fully engaged before this crisis hit in the support work on behalf of our members with both governments for the UK-US free trade agreement, and it's very interesting because the there wasn't a lot of negative feeling about a UK free trade agreement from the House. You know, there was a very some issues about Huawei and one or two other, and access for food and so on, agricultural products. But generally, the people we spoke to, including some kind of people that you would think would be opposed to trade agreements, was very positive in the House. And we felt that agreement, with goodwill on both sides and sensible government decision makers on both sides, there was a good chance of that getting passed. Now, what happens now with a potential change in administration and the expiry of the Trade Promotion Authority next year means that's kind of all up in the air. But what's your sense that the attitude towards globalization and trade has always been a mixed issue in the Democratic Party? What is this going to be an important item in the campaign, or is it just a side issue for wonks like me?
It's not going to be an explicit issue, but it's going to lurk in the background in huge ways. As I said, one of the four big questions is really about sort of what's the post-COVID world we want. And a lot of that gets down to questions about globalization. And globalization is quite complicated because it includes things like trade. It also includes how do we feel about climate change, how do we feel about pandemics? Is the world inevitably interconnected, or do we try to retreat from the world? So it runs in a lot of ways, and it cuts different ways, left and right, Democratic and Republican, as you get into different aspects of it. But on trade, actually, since 2016, there's been a huge increase in public support for trade. There's now very solid public support, at least there was until COVID. The Chicago Council on Global Affairs, which has the gold standard polling on this, shows that after 2016, support for a whole bunch of reasons increased quite a bit, more than a 20-point net swing in support for trade. And so the issue is not so much the public here. And I think, there's plenty of public support in the abstract for trade. There's two huge issues, though, that are going to stand in the way. One is China, about which the public has pretty negative feelings. Now, you might conclude, as the Obama administration did, that the best way to deal with China is to get all the countries around China together in a trade agreement. But, or it might be, we don't need, we don't want.
Good luck with that.
Yeah, we don't want trade agreements because China has showed us that trade with other countries is dangerous. So it can cut both ways. The other big issue is that although people support trade in the abstract now, there's this huge worry about what's basically becoming a biomedical arms race and biomedical nationalism, in a sense that we have to have our own masks and our own respirators and our own reagents and our own supply chains on anything related to health. And that's going to stand in the way of it. But if we can deal with the health issues, and if we can deal with China, I think on lots of things, whether it's EU, US, UK, US, there's a lot of space for bipartisan support for trade agreements. And we saw that on the new NAFTA replacement, where it wasn't actually that hard to get bipartisan agreement. I think it's a complicated issue, and it's more complicated now, and it's always difficult because some of the labor environmental issues within the Democratic Party, but I don't think it's actually that hard if you can get past the health issues and the China issues.
Yeah, and I think some of the big supranational organizations are going to come under a fair amount of scrutiny as well. And I think that's going to be a bipartisan issue as well, probably for different reasons. But I think funding, decision making, processes in organizations famously like WHO and WTO are going to be really scrutinized. Maybe not immediately, but they're definitely going to be on the table. We're right at the edge of it, so I'm going to ask you both. I'm not going to ask you for a prediction of the outcome. You can give one if you'd like, but I'm kind of interested in just a sentence about, is there an event? I know making predictions is difficult, especially about the future. But is there an event that we should look out for over the next month or 2 months that's going to be decisive, or what is something that might be a decisive influence over how it goes in November. I don't know, Jeremy, do you want to go first?
Sure, I think there's a few things. One is I would look real hard at what the COVID incidence and death rates look like in places like Georgia and South Carolina that are reopening early. You know, for sure, it's a balance between economy and health, but you have governors like the one in Georgia where the rates were still going up. He's not even abiding by the guidelines that President Trump suggested, where you have 14 days of rates going down before you reopen. He's reopening when rates are going up. If you see a spike in cases and deaths there, I think that could change the conversation quite a bit. Second, I would look very carefully at what the Democrats do and what Biden does on the economy. I think Democrats have to come forward, and Biden has to come forward with quite a strong economic vision and plan, and establish that although Trump may be a businessman, Biden has plans for business. I think you'll hear him talking a lot about the fact that, given the importance of Michigan, that he's the guy who led the effort on bring back the auto industry after the 2008 meltdown. So I think that's quite important. I won't make predictions about the outcome because, we are in utterly unpredictable times. But, obviously, if there's something like a vaccine gets discovered much earlier, that would change the dynamics fundamentally. But absent that, the underlying fundamentals, I just think, look very hard for President Trump right now. It's going to be a very close election, and America is a bitterly divided country. But the notion, it's hard to imagine that it's going to, absent a vaccine or something like that, that it's going to be much better after another 6 months of social distancing, deep recession, double-digit unemployment, record poverty rates. It's just hard to imagine that the mood's going to be better. But, it really is an unpredictable time.
Unhi?
Yeah, no, I would agree with the idea that there's great unpredictability. I suppose the one thing I would leave everyone with is that the usual rules probably won't apply. So we're used to seeing political conventions in the summer that produce some kind of benefit for the candidate. We're used to seeing the fall debates mattering. It's not clear to me that any of the traditional campaign markers that we look for are going to be the ones that are actually going to influence public opinion in a meaningful way. I do think it's going to come down to questions of the handling of the response, how the economy performs, how people are feeling about their economic condition. Those are things that are well beyond the purview and scope of what a typical presidential campaign has within its ability to control. And so these factors, up to and including whether we find a vaccine or an effective therapeutic for coronavirus, I think will be ultimately more impactful than some of the events along the way that we're used to watching.
Well, as always, an absolutely fascinating conversation. And for those of us who are political obsessives, and it's the greatest show on earth, the US election, and it's going to be an unusual one this year, but it's going to be fascinating nonetheless. So I'd just like to say a huge thank you to Lan Hee Chen from Brunswick and Jeremy Rosner from GQR. Thank you very much for being our guest today and for sharing your insight with our members. We really appreciate it. And thank you all very much for joining, and we'll see you again at another BAB event in the coming days. Thank you.
Thank you, Duncan.
Thank you very much.